In this set of lecture videos, I'm going to be talking about Congress. After you watch all these lecture videos, you'll be able to describe the role of the formal leaders of the House and the Senate. You'll be able to identify 3 powers that are unique to the House of Representatives, as well as 3 powers that are unique to the United States Senate. You'll be able to identify and describe the 4 primary functions of Congress and identify the difference between trustee and delegate forms of representation. You'll also be able to identify the factors that affect whether a member of Congress is more likely to behave like a delegate or a trustee. And you'll explain how the House and Senate differ in regards to that distinction. You'll be able to explain why Congress is organized in committees, why most of the work in Congress is done in committees, and you'll be able to explain some of the benefits of being the majority party in the House and the Senate. You'll also be able to explain why the House of Representatives is considered a majoritarian institution and why the Senate is a non-majoritarian institution. You'll also be able to explain how filibusters prevent bills from passing in the Senate, at least in theory, and then you'll be able to explain the meaning of invoking cloture and the rules associated with it. So that's a lot. And if that didn't make any sense, well, hopefully it will by the time we're done. Let's start off with some basic facts about Congress. Now, some of these you may already know, but I think it's really good to review this. First thing to remember, and we actually talked about this when we talked about the Constitution, Congress is a bicameral legislature. Now, hopefully you remember what I mean by bicameral. Bicameral means that there are 2 houses. I think it's bi and cameral is like 2 chambers. So we have the House of Representatives, we have the Senate. So that's what we mean by bicameral. So first let's talk about the House of Representatives. In terms of membership, there are 435 members of the House of Representatives. Okay, this number has changed over time, but I think around the early 1900s, it kept increasing and increasing, and then they finally set on 435, and it hasn't changed since. Congress could increase the number of people in Congress, but they just haven't. When the country first started, your average member of Congress represented around 30,000 people. Now, your average member of the House, I should say the House of Representatives, so the senators represent however many people in their state. But members of the House, right, it used to be 30,000. Now, on average, members of the House of Representatives represent around 700,000 people. So that's a big shift. In terms of the method by which they're elected, members of the House are elected directly. Now, again, we talked about this when we talked about the Constitution. A direct election just means that you have voters here, you have candidates here, and the voters vote directly for the candidates, and whichever candidate gets a plurality wins. So it's a direct election. What makes it direct? Voters are voting directly for the candidates. In terms of the term of office, how long do they serve for? Members of the House are elected for 2 years. So if a member of Congress is elected in 2022, they're going to be up for re-election in 2024. If they're elected if they get re-elected in 2024, they're going to be up for re-election in 2026. So every 2 years, members of the House are up for re-election every 2 years. Now, in terms of limits on how many times they can run, there are no limits. Members of the House can run for as many times as they can get reelected. And this is a source of debate among a lot of people as to whether or not members of the House, or the Senate for that matter, should be able to run as many times as they want. There are people who say that there should be term limits, right? That if you win 8 times, so that means you've served for 16 years, that should be the limit. And then there are other people who argue that if you're doing a good job and your constituents want to vote for you, why should you not be able to vote for the person that you want to be your representative? And so this is a debate that goes on quite frequently about Congress. Now, in terms of representation, and you should remember this, maybe not you should, but hopefully you remember this from our discussion of the Constitution. Representation in the House is based on proportional representation, meaning the number of representatives that a state gets is based on the population of the state. So California, at the time of this recording, California has 53 representatives in the House. Apparently that's going to change. That winds up being around 12.8% of the members of the House are from California. Well, if you take California's population and you divide it into the overall population of the United States, it's around 12.8%, right? So the percentage is about the same. The representation in the House and population is about the same. There are some discrepancies, but they're not particularly important. Now, on the screen, there's a map of Nebraska. And Nebraska has 3 congressional districts because based on their population, that's all they were allotted. And so what you can see on the left-hand side, in sort of that bluish color, is the 3rd congressional district. The 3rd congressional district is huge. It takes up like 3/4 of Nebraska. Then the 1st congressional district, kind of in that lavender color, it's like about 1/4 of Nebraska. And then you can see the 2nd congressional district is actually kind of small. It's like in the center on the far right-hand side, like in the center of the state right next to Iowa. Well, the thing that stands out in all of this is that these congressional districts are very different in terms of size. But that's because in the 3rd congressional district, that's all farmland. That's all they do in Nebraska is they grow corn and football players. That's it, the whole place. You can drive for miles and not see anybody. In the 1st congressional district, you can see that Lincoln, Nebraska is in the 1st congressional district. This is like a big city, or for Nebraska, it's a big city, right? And then the 2nd congressional district, that's where Omaha is, and then there are some universities there as well. And so the population is really big. And so that's why, even though the size of these districts physically is very different, the population in each one is the same. And so every member of Congress more or less represents the same number of people. Next, I want to talk about the formal leadership of the House of Representatives. And when I say the formal leadership, I'm talking about the way the rules are set up. There are times when there are certain members of Congress who are real popular, and so they wind up exerting more influence than they would otherwise, just because everybody knows them and they get on the news a lot. So this is the formal leadership. The head of the House of Representatives is called the Speaker of the House. Speaker of the House. Now, the Speaker of the House always comes from the majority party. The majority party is the party that has a majority of members. Remember, we just basically have Democrats and Republicans. That's it. Sorry for all you members of the Reform Party, the Green Party, the Peace and Freedom Party. You guys don't win elections. We talked about this before. So if whichever party, either the Democrats or the Republicans, have the most members, they're the majority party. Well, the Speaker of the House is a member of the majority party. Speaker is really important. In terms of the House, the Speaker controls the agenda. They control what's happening in the House of Representatives. The other thing that's interesting to know about the Speaker of the House is the Speaker of the House is 3rd in the line of succession after the Vice President. So, right, so if something happened to the president were to die or quit or, you know, retire or whatever, then the vice president would take over. If God forbid something should happen to the president and the vice president, the Speaker of the House would become president of the United States. The next person in terms of the formal hierarchy is the majority leader. Again, the majority leader is called the majority leader because they are a member of the majority party. And they're the ones who manage the day-to-day operations of the House. They're like the manager in a warehouse who's like making sure everything is happening. Right? The speaker's off in her office strategizing and doing other things. The majority leader is handling the day-to-day operations. There's also a minority leader. The minority leader is the chief spokesman for the opposition party, the minority party. They don't have very much power, and so mostly they complain a lot about the fact that they don't have very much power, but that's their job. And then both parties have something called party whips. Now, it comes from whip as in whipping people into shape, right? So there are whips for the majority party, there are whips for the minority party. What their job is to act as a liaison between the party leadership and the members of Congress of the same party. So if a bill is coming up that's going to be voted on and the party leadership wants to know if members of their party support it, they'll send the party whips out and they'll talk to all the members of the party and say, hey, look, how are you planning on voting on this? We're trying to keep track, because they don't want to lose a vote. They don't want to bring a bill to the floor to be voted on and then have it lose because a bunch of their members aren't going to support it. Sometimes if a bill is really important to the party leadership, they'll send the party leaders down, the whips down, and put pressure on members of the House. They'll be like, hey, look, you guys, you know, the speaker gave you a lot of money for your election and she campaigned in your district, right? Maybe you should back her up on this one. If not, she might be busy when you're up for re-election. And so they'll try and put pressure sometimes on members of the House to vote the way the party leadership wants them to do. And when it says count votes on the lecture notes, what I'm referring to is the idea that sometimes the party leadership doesn't know exactly how many people support a bill or oppose a bill. It's the party whip's job to go and find out how many people will vote in favor, how many people will vote against. Okay? In the next video, I'm going to be talking about powers that are unique to the House of Representatives. This is a really important part, which is my way of saying this has a high probability of being one of the questions on the exam.